friends.
Good morning.
I don't want to spend too much time on the personal gratitude part, but I am grateful to be among you this morning. David got that right. I have had good and fun associations with friends already, and I'm looking forward to doing that again. So thank you for this opportunity. This is also, coincidentally, the closest to home I've ever pastored or interim or anything. So I already had one person walk up to me and say, "Oh, our grandfathers farmed together." That's a whole different kind of experience that I'm looking forward to having. So thank you. You know, it was a bloody mess to begin with, but it became a beloved celebration of the deliverance of God. Take a lamb, kill it dark, drain all the blood out, cook it whole, head, legs, guts, all. Whatever you don't eat, don't boil it, cook it on fire. So the smell of seared flesh will fill every nostril within the spread of the smoke. Take the blood and splash it over your front door so all the neighbors can see it. If there's anything left, burn it to ashes. Verse 14, you're going to remember this. Now, we don't do a lot of life and death religion like that in our experience. We don't. It's usually not that vivid, you know. We tend to take a more sanitized approach to the way we experience and express our faith. Now, there are still people who do more vivid expressions of it. A friend of mine and former teacher, Dr. Bill Leonard, was a founding dean over at Wake Forest School of Divinity. He used to teach a class on Appalachian religions. And of course, you can't teach a class on Appalachian religion without satisfying everyone's desire to hear a little bit about snake handling, even though it's not really all that big a thing in Appalachian religions. But the thing he would say about snake handling is, what you have to understand about it is that it's not a frivolous thing folks do for fun. It's a sacramental practice in which the grace of God is mediated, just like through any other sacrament that parts of the Christian family have come up with. Except in this case, the sacrament is alive and it can kill. That's life and death religion. We don't do a lot of that. Perhaps you're familiar with the Santeria or voodoo practices of the Caribbean, where really a freshly slaughtered animal might be just as readily expected a part of the worship experience as waiting in silence would be here at Deep River on a given Sunday morning. But we don't tend to do life and death religion. We've sanitized it. Have you ever been to a Seder meal? Have you ever had the chance to be invited to one of those? A Seder meal is a long-standing tradition in the feast, in the Jewish tradition, that is a remembrance of this passage, of the Passover. The Passover, chapter 12 of Exodus 1 through 14 that David just read for us, is the origin story of the Seder meal. It is the centuries celebrated remembrance of that stark, vivid, graphic experience. Except it's different. If you've ever had a chance to learn about or see or experience a Seder meal, you would notice that usually there's not a roasted lamb on a spit out back anywhere. It's usually a very fine china. It's dainty proportions, a mandatory 4 glasses of wine. It's a whole thing. Children play games and sing songs, and grandparents tell stories, and it's designed to carry this memory of deliverance from generation to generation. It carries the essence of the core of the faith of Jewish traditions, deliverance of God. But it's not celebrated now in anxious waiting with sandals on feet and clothes girded up and a staff in hand, ready to navigate difficult journeys. No, today, when a Seder is experienced, first of all, it's a bit distinctive among Jewish festivals. Most of them are celebrated in the synagogue. The Seder is celebrated in the home. It's a different kind of experience, and it's usually done at ease, relaxed, reclined even perhaps sometimes, because it is not a remembrance of the drudgery of the Exodus. It is not a remembrance of the difficulty of the experience or the horrid graphic nature of that whole slaughter thing. A Seder meal is a remembrance of the completed deliverance of God. Now, how does something get from horrid, graphic, life and death, vivid, to sanitized, leisurely, reclined, almost quaint remembrance? Have you celebrated Easter lately? I mean, we've done the same thing. We typically, what's our motif for celebrating Easter? It's new clothes and blooming lilies. Those are the images that we associate with it. With a few notable anecdotal exceptions, in Latin America and a couple other places, most of us don't take a trek through town with a cross heavy enough to make us stumble. Most of us don't flagellate ourselves until we're a bloody, raw mess like Jesus was before he went to the cross. There are places where there is a more vividly vicious experience and celebration of Easter, but they're notable because they're the exception to the rule, that most of us do it in a far more sanitized kind of way. How do you get from there to here? God said to Moses and Aaron, you're going to remember this. Mark your days. This experience that you're about to have is going to be so important that it's going to reorient how you reference time. Mark your days. You stand in a similar kind of place where you have that same sort of challenge. You're about to go through an experience in this interim. Been a long time since you've done it. You're not very well practiced at it. Almost 20 years since you've done this? Being on an interim search committee is one of the most challenging jobs in any congregation, in any tradition, because it's the one thing that never gets to practice. If you've been on the finance committee or ministry and council or anything like that, that's standing work. You get to do that work over and over, and you get to get good at it. You get to get familiar with it and comfortable with it. But when you go through this search process, you almost always start from scratch. It may have been decades since you did it last. Half of you have never done it before, and those of you who did, it's been so long, you sort of remember it. There's a good chance it might look like a bloody mess. You need to be ready for that. Now, that's not a promise or a prediction, but it's an observation of a distinct possibility. But here's the good news. You can get past that, and you can come out of this with something worth remembering, celebrating even, that looks more like the deliverance of God than a horrid, vivid tragedy. Okay? But how does that happen? Moses and Aaron went into this experience planning to remember. Right up front, that was part of the directions. You're going to remember this, so be careful how you remember it. That's part of the work that you have to do. You are now tasked with choosing your memories from this experience that you're about to go through. And the way you do that is by choosing how you focus your attention while you're going through it. What are you going to give your focus to? What are you not going to be distracted by? How are you going to discipline yourselves to be present in the moment, but not be overwhelmed by it? Because a temporary vacuum in leadership can be overwhelming and disorienting, but it doesn't have to be. One of the reasons I'm glad to be back among Quakers is because I've had the opportunity to look deep into my history and yours by the practical experience of having also pastored an extremely old Baptist congregation. Now, you all have been around a while, right? How old are y'all? 267 years. Y'all are older than them. I pastored a Baptist church that hails from the late 1700s, and they, I think they're the third oldest Baptist church in the state that's been operating. So they got history. I want to tell you the most salient observation I made as I enjoyed getting familiar with Quaker history in North Carolina, and as I had occasion to get more familiar than I was with some particular Baptist history in the state of North Carolina. Here's the observation I made. You all both had interactions with Native Americans who were your neighbors in these places, but they were different. If you read the history of the Baptist church I pastored, their history is littered with violent conflicts with Native American neighbors. They just fought all the time. Your history reads different. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't some anecdotal exceptions to the trend that I may or may not be aware of, but by and large, you all walked through the world historically looking for friends, and you tended to find them. Unfortunately, my forebears tended to go through the world looking for enemies. They tended to find them. You tend to find what you're looking for, don't you? You're going to remember this. Mark your days carefully. Mind your attention as you go through this process. Because you have the responsibility now of choosing your memories, of focusing on the deliverance of this congregation to become the meeting that God is calling you to become. You're not the meeting you were 200 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 15 years ago, or 5. I imagine you've changed a lot in just the last year. That may be the understatement of the day. But if you want to have stuff to celebrate later, you'll have to make it so. It won't happen accidentally, reliably. It might, but I don't think you want to count on that. Mark your days. Mind your attention. Whatever God is calling you to become as a meeting, God will deliver you through whatever twists and turns and potholes and pitfalls may lie in your path in these next few unfamiliar weeks and months. But whatever it is that God's calling you to become and to be about, God will equip you to be and equip you to do. Your job is to mind your attention and listen. And you've got a long enough history of listening to the leadings of the Spirit that I'm just going to go on ahead out of the gate and trust you to do it again. So I'm looking forward to this. And I hope you are too, because you get to the good by dealing with the bad and the ugly head on, forthrightly. And even if it starts out being a bloody mess, deliverance is the end of the story. I believe that. And I believe that's what you will experience in this process. But you'll have to mean